Hello! How's it going? I hope you're doing well. What am I going to do today? I'm going to talk to you about how I created the visuals for my Percussive Maintenance project. In the previous video in this little series, I talked about how I did the music, and now I'm going to talk about how I created the visuals. This is what we're going to have a look at. Right, so I'm just gonna mute that now and leave it running. So this project actually has a similar setup to the last time I did the Evman AV project that I shared on here and did a little series on. It uses a lot of the same devices that were created by my friend Sem, and it sends OSC data from Ableton into Unreal and then drives all of this cool animation and move and physics and that kind of stuff inside of Unreal, and lights and God knows what else. The last project I showed you, I was doing a live set controlling everything from a MIDI controller. I still use that live set, but for this I wanted to create a visualizer for existing tracks that I'd already made. So what I did is I bounced the tracks to stereo and I bust them all into, well, these are side A and side B of the cassette tape, so this is the same run time as the cassette. So the OSC data is generated as before by using these little Max for Live devices that my friend made, and in this case, these are the little envelope followers. They take audio in amplitude, turn that into a value using an envelope follower, and that value then gets sent to a specific channel inside of Unreal. I used an audio effect rack containing a couple of instances of multiband dynamics, which I used to split the frequencies into 3 bands so that I had a little bit more discrete control over which bands I wanted to send into Unreal. I used that to split the frequencies, and as you can see here, the low frequencies are being sent to track address 1, the mid frequencies to track address 2, and the high frequencies are being sent to track address 3. Then there's another one called kick envelope, which is being sent to track 4. What it does is it's kind of dialed in to follow the frequencies of the kick drum, or at least like around the kick drum to get like kind of the knock. The reason for that is because I wanted to be able to get an impulse that I could then use to use a threshold to trigger events and timelines inside of Unreal. I'm also using it to control the camera. So I've got another track here, which is a MIDI track, which is sending MIDI notes to a specific object in Unreal, which is controlling the cameras, like an array of cameras, and switching between them based on incoming MIDI notes. And to process or to receive those MIDI notes from the audio, what I did was I processed the kick frequency to try and get it as snappy as possible. Then I'm using the CV envelope follower from CV Tools to generate these triggers, and that is then going into a CV in object, which is capable of converting the CV data into MIDI notes. And then I set the range here, and that is then being routed into the camera track. Then on the camera track, I've got like a probability gate here, so it sends 10% of incoming MIDI notes through, and then this random and this scale serve to limit the range to the scale of note absolute 0, so C -2 to 12 notes above that, and that is then being sent to track address 13. Well, while it's playing, you can see every now and then a little note gets sent through. That's what I want, because when I run it in Unreal, instead of having the camera constantly jumping around on each incoming trigger, because I've got that little probability gate set up, it like occasionally switches cameras when a kick drum gets fired off. So that's pretty useful. And that's pretty much it. That's everything that's being done inside of Ableton. So you can see, to mute that again. So you can see that inside of Unreal, we've got this tentacle monster thing spinning around and kicking all these cars around and little bits of debris. And then there's some lights kind of randomly firing off as well. And then there's that big light in the middle, which is responding to the amplitude of the mid frequencies, which is more apparent in other tracks. I'll show you in a moment. The tentacle monster is actually fairly simple in its sort of in how it's made. I'm just going to open Blender real quick. Come on. Why is Blender starting slow? Welcome to Grey with Tristan. All right. So why did I delete the default cube? That is on a project I wasn't going to save anyway. That is some Blender user shit. Anyway, so this is a tentacle that I made. It is made by sculpting this weird alien looking tentacle thing, slightly horrifying and lovely jubbly. Then I created a low poly version of that, and I baked the normal map details, the normal details onto there. So you can see it's actually really low poly, but it kind of works. And I baked an emissive that I made from like a cavity map that I also baked from the high poly one, and I'd also baked this out. So these were maps that I also imported into Unreal because they're useful there. That's how I made the tentacle. Alright, now let's leave Blender. Bye bye. And then I put a whole bunch of those in here. And first thing I did was I created for the asset a physics asset. Behold the physics asset. It's a little messy, doesn't matter though, it totally works. And in this case, all I wanted to do was create like ragdoll physics for it. So all the bones are just simulating physics, and then the bottom one is kind of locked in place so that I can attach that to something, and the rest can just flop around. Then inside of the actor itself, there's also a rotating movement component, so that's what kind of spins it around. So the first thing that's also one of the things I addressed using the incoming signals from Ableton. So when Ableton is running, I'm just going to leave this running in the background. Yep. You can see there's data coming in here. And that is whenever an envelope is received from Ableton, which is pretty much constantly. Values get sent to the base envelope, mid envelope, and high envelope, and the kick transient envelope. Those envelopes also then get used to create a rotator. So the high envelope, mid, and base envelope values are multiplied and plugged into this rotator object, and that can then get set as that gets used to set the rotating movement's rate here. So depending on what frequencies come in, this giant thing is going to be spinning around like in a certain direction, and then when it shifts frequencies to something else, well, I'll just show you real quick. Show, don't tell. I'll use a different song. I actually really like this bit. So it's going like slowly in a certain direction as soon as the kick comes in. Yeah, that's what we want. That's the kind of reactivity I really like, because you know you get these sort of contrast when this sort of contrasting effect when something is kind of low intensity or relatively low intensity, and then when something heavy comes back in, and it has that kind of visual impact that I always think is really powerful. The next thing that I'm using to drive something is actually the materials of the tentacle. So I'm just going to grab that real quick. Tentacle. Right. So this one's a bit scary looking, but it's not so bad. Preview the right mesh. Yeah, that's a bit better. Right, so here's a tentacle material, and this is just the color, a linear gradient over this original color that's then also being multiplied by this gray value so that you get this sort of gentle slope upwards in darkness. Then there's a noise that's just on the roughness, nothing fancy. The emissive is where all the magic's happening. And that is being driven by two parameters. It's receiving sphere mask scale, which is a spherical mask that's driving, I'll just set this to real time. Spherical mask that's driving this kind of sweep that goes over the object. So that goes from 0 to 1. When that value of 0 to 1 comes in, it kind of moves this kind of white gradient across the emissive from the bottom to the top. When you look in the world, you can see when the kicks come in, you can see how it kind of pushes outward. So what's happening there is you've got this sphere mask object that is using the owner position, so the position of the owner of this material, checked against the absolute world position, and then I've duplicated that and scaled it down a little bit, and then that one is subtracting from the first one so that the sphere mask is not just like making it white but getting dark again after it scales up. Then that gets multiplied with this mask that I generated from Blender, and then that gets added here. And then there's this orange movement that's going over it, this sort of internal glow effect. That is basically just in a color, which is set to this orange color. That's being multiplied by the emit strength times 10. So that's what's driving that's like this color here. That is being multiplied here with this sweeping gradient. So the gradient is created by taking texture coordinate node, masking it by masking the y-axis or G. That gets added to time multiplied by this speed value, which I've set to 0.5. And that gets piped into a sine and then a constant bias, which kind of controls the output. So if you just add them together, this is what you end up with, this really blown out look. But if you put that into a sine, that kind of clamps the value to a sine, and then the bias is also important because that kind of sets the smoothness of this gradient. Then that gets multiplied again with just this noise. So this is the sort of mask then that gets multiplied with the color, emissive color. And that again gets multiplied with that same mask that we got from Blender earlier. The white kind of sweeping sphere mask thing gets added here, and then that gets piped into the emissive color. Yeah. So to control these parameters, again inside of Blueprint, to control the brightness of the orange thing, that is really simple. I've set my dynamic material in the construction script. I create a dynamic material instance and apply that to each of the tentacles in the array. And then this gets set by the base envelope value. So you can see here, emit strength, it's set scalar parameter value. That is the variable of the material, dynamic material instance, and that gets set here. And that is what drives just the brightness of this orange thing, right? Then to create the sweeping movement that comes from the kick drums, what I've done here on the kick transient, as soon as the kick transient crosses a threshold of 0.65, so it's always, the transients are always a value of 0, somewhere between 0 and 1. I've found that the value of 0.65 was working for me. So as soon as the kick crosses that threshold, it fires from start a timeline, which in this case moves up in this curve. And then that is used to drive the sphere mask scale, which we have shown here. So that's this value, right? Okie dokie. So those two things are what drive the glow inside of these tentacles and the sort of movement of the thing that sweeps outward. Then, all of these little car guys that are flying around, they are spawned by an object that I've called Car Vortex. It also, same as Tentacle Guy, listens to the OSC router. It's got a variable here that references the OSC router that's in the level. And it receives also track 1 for the bass and 4 for the kick envelope. What Car Vortex does is it has this box here, which is represented here in by these yellow lines. Excuse me while I drink something. So as soon as the scene starts playing, it spawns a bunch of these cars from, they're called car mesh, but they're actually just a bunch of static meshes. It started out with just cars, but eventually I added a whole bunch of other objects to the array to create more variation, because it made more sense if it wasn't just cars that the thing was pushing around. So I added a bunch of like pipes and a dumpster and a chair and a few tires and barrels and Car Vortex does a few things. So it contains this sphere object. I'm just going to set the sphere object to be visible for now. So this looks a bit weird, right? What's happening here is on the kick envelope, same as in the tentacle monster we saw earlier. Soon as the kick crosses the threshold, it plays this envelope. So that is like it goes up sharply and then slopes down back to 0. That is mapped to the scale using a map range clamp of the world scale 3D of that sphere object. So it pushes out all the physical objects just by slamming into them by scaling it up and scaling it down again. And then the second kind of important component that this Car Vortex also contains is a radial force. And that gets set using on event tick from the base envelope value. So when track address number 1 comes in, set the base envelope value, that gets used here to map again to a range of, in this case, really high values, minus 50,000 to minus 2 million. And that gets used to set the force strength of the radial force. And that's what draws all these cars in when the bass activates. I'm just going to play a little different piece of the music where there's a little more kind of variation, because this song is quite 4 to the floor. So you can see what's happening is when the base envelope gets activated, all the cars kind of get pulled back in, but the sphere, because it's being scaled up by the kick drum, is then pushing them out again. So yeah, I really like that sort of push-pull effect. So that's actually the main interaction that's happening here. And then there's some other objects. So you can see these little point lights going off. They are just an actor containing a point light, and whenever they receive on track 4 the kick transient envelope value, as soon as that crosses over a certain threshold, in this case 0.4 I've set. I mean, this is quite, it's just like, the values I kind of eyeball them until they work. So that's just kind of what worked for me. Then I do an extra check, which is essentially another probability gate, because I set a random float, and if that random float is above 0.8, then it's allowed to go through. And then when it does go through, it simply sets the intensity using a timeline and the same kind of like snappy envelope and it sets and it multiplies that value by 10,000 and then sets the intensity of the point light inside of here using that value. All right, and then there's this sort of central light. It is being set using track 2, so the mids, which are usually present in some form or other, but it's just being set as a multiplier, also just to set the intensity of the spotlight. It's a subtle effect, but it's actually noticeable during the transitional periods. Right. Cool. So that's pretty much it for the Ableton to Unreal reactivity that I've set up. It is more simple than the last project I did that I showed on here, in which I used all these individual tracks from Ableton, sending both MIDI and envelope data, which, I mean, if you want to get really granular and have a whole bunch of different things reacting to individual instruments, you can absolutely do that, and it's really awesome. But in this case, for this project, what I wanted to do was create a visualizer, and just like an album visualizer, I wanted to be able to do it using just like a finished mix, because I get a lot of questions from people as well asking, like, can you do this using like not individual tracks? And well, yes, you can. It just takes a little bit of work, like to figure out how you're going to split frequency bands, if you're even going to do that, if you're going to use the amplitude. Like, it works really well for this kind of music because it's got most of the dynamics come from the kick and the bass coming and going, right? I mean, there are ways to, like, you know, hone in on like different spectrums of, for example, the kick and the snare. So if you were doing something that was more drum and bass focused, you might want to see if you can get the snare out there as well. And you'd use a similar method if you want to do more audio analysis. And I think you can even do quite a lot of that stuff within Unreal, although, to be honest, I haven't really looked into that much, because I've always preferred being able to more granularly process my audio inside of Ableton before sending it to Unreal. So after I'd done this and had this set up, what I wanted to do is create like a sort of illustrative kind of image that didn't feel static. So I used Resolume for that, because in my usual day job, I do a lot of visuals for events. So I'm very comfortable using Resolume, and I know it's really good for this kind of like live compositing of images. I built this file into a game, as it were, played that, set that to full screen, played it, and then piped the output from this computer using a little video capture device into Resolume on a separate laptop, and then and layered the output from this with a bunch of extra like graphics and that kind of stuff to make it look like a cool image. And then I recorded that, and that's what became the final visualizer. All right, Godspeed. This might be it. This might be the take. Or I might have to do it 5 more times, knowing myself. That's very likely. So now I will show you how I did that inside of Resolume. Alrighty, let's go to Resolume. Right, here we are in Resolume. I've just copied the project over from my laptop so I can show it to you on my PC, because it's a bigger, nicer screen and it's easier for recording. But this is Resolume. So I've got the input coming in from Unreal. Right now I'm just representing that with a screenshot. There's some audio reactive stuff happening in Resolume, which is now currently, you won't be able to see now, but you will be able to see on the final output. And when I show you on the laptop, because I can't route audio into this right now, it's a whole story. Forget about it. Desaturating it a little bit, I put a CRT kind of like scan line thing over it. And then I put this super glitch effect from JuiceBar on it. JuiceBar is sort of a plugin center for Resolume where people can share plugins that they made for it. And super glitch is one of them. So is the CRT one and a couple of other things I've used. At the bottom of the whole composition, I've just put this kind of subtle gradient that's kind of make it less black. Then I added this grid overlay on top of that as well. Then comes the input from the video. Then I put this thing here, put another grid, and that is also got like being projected onto this kind of sphere effect using the Stingy Sphere, which is just like a stock plugin from Resolume. It's sort of a slightly glitchy sphere, but like the original input is just this grid that you see here vaguely, and then that maps it onto this sphere, and then I use the FFT input to control a couple of parameters here as well, and the envelope of the I put an envelope on the rotation of the sphere so it moves around a little bit, so that kind of bounces around in a subtle way. This effect here is kind of serves as like a little background for these block, and then the titles come here using just simple text animators. They also have a little glitch effect, the same glitch effect that's here, and it is also the wobble of the glitch, which is this, and this here, that's also been driven by the audio, as is a little bit of the red and green shift here, but only in a very small amount. Then I've got this side A and side B text, much the same. There's a tiny little text animator there that says Evtech is Machine Music by Tristan Gila. It's very subtle, and it's using this envelope to kind of semi-randomly bring the opacity of the letters in and out. Then this layer I will show you on the laptop is where I put the spout input from the OSC message feed, which I just placed here, which is just like a sort of scrolling feed of the incoming envelope messages. This is a waveform. It is a really cool waveform plugin, also available on JuiceBar, that was made by Chris. I will link to it in the description. It's really cool. Then I put a gradient up here, very simple stuff, and put the logo on top of that. That also has some effects. It's being masked, and did some, let's see, what did I do to it? Oh yeah, that is inside of this group, which then has the displacer blend mode. So this actually, when this thing moves around, you can see there it actually displaces the logo. So there's this thing, I'll just show it real quick, this effect, which is audio fluid, which is a source also available, I think, from JuiceBar, and it uses a little bit of FFT input as well, so audio input to control the blobs. And then I put a low res effect on there to make it all blocky. Then I used the displacer blend mode, also available from JuiceBar, and that sort of creates these blocky glitches on the logo. Then I created this cube effect using a grid. So this grid, and I used the Cube 3D effect from JuiceBar to map that onto a cube, and that also uses FFT. Where was it again? Yeah, to sort of slightly do this on the audio input, and then there's another parameter that gets pushed somewhere. There we go. So this is the scale of the grid that's mapped onto the cube, and it kind of creates this effect. Cool. So this is all kind of like simple Resolume stuff, but it's fun, you know, like it's fun to layer stuff, stack it all up as the name of the logo. I use the parameters of the text itself to kind of animate the brightness of the letters a little bit. And then I put this guy here as well, and I'm using an invert RGB here, which is also being driven by the audio amplitude that's controlling it. The opacity, actually, it turned out a little bit grayer than I would have hoped, because it ends up here often. I actually wanted it to push there, but never mind. And then I used outliner. I'll just make the width a bit bigger here. So this comes with Chaser, which is this plugin that my good mate Joris made. It allows you to sequence slices from the advanced output in Resolume. So in Resolume, you've got the advanced output. You can create your slices wherever you want them, and then Chaser reads those slices and can do some things to it, mainly animating like stepped slices, but it also comes with a bunch of extra plugins like Outliner and also, for example, Random, which will make things glitch around as well and move around. It's an incredibly useful tool if you do setups with big screens that are like spread across the room. It's kind of become like invaluable for VJs. People who aren't, all the VJs watching this are already like, yeah, okay, get on with it. Cool. So that's it for the most part. Obviously, there's a few other little things that I did under the hood to get this all looking the way it looks now, but most of it's just tweaking and fiddling and finding things out as I go along. There's a lot of trial and error that goes into this kind of stuff. I really appreciate everyone that came and had a look, and I hope you enjoyed it. And if you want to support me, you can buy the EP on Bandcamp, or you can buy me a coffee or buy my samples on Ko-fi. I really appreciate you. I hope that you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you in the next one.